I have the opportunity to work with top-tier US VCs. I was happy, but decided to go back to Japan when the Japan was not totally entrepreneurship is almost zero. And in order to pay it back, doing some building my career in the US, that is one way, but building my career in Japan and execute on what I have learned, if I can execute my learning from them, that is a way to contribute or to show my appreciation to those my sensei.
Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to hear your story. Actually, I found him. I and Ryan, so we co-hosted a AI agent event in here. Ken, he was sponsor. So he gave us a venue, his office, and also he gave us amazing pizza. And the reason why I couldn't stop asking him, hey, please join our podcast, was so he is a visionary person who supports Japanese startup ecosystem. So he knew Silicon Valley culture and also Japanese startup scene. That's why, he has like passion, like fire. So that's why I wanted to ask him. Okay, tell us about yourself, Ken. What do you do in Tokyo?
Well, Kaori-san, first of all, thank you for inviting me in this amazing podcast. I'm very much look forward to talking with you. And first of all, to answer first question, so I'm currently the founder and the managing partner at the VC called Global Hands-On VC. This is a firm that invests in the Japanese technology startup and help them going global with their hands-on support. Established by 2 Japanese and 3 Americans, and the founder include serial entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, ex-Oracle founder, ex-Salesforce Japan founders, and also Stanford professor, or very famous opinion leader in the Japanese software engineering market. So, this full of senior and experienced people as a partners. So that is a form. I'm going to get back to you more detail in our activity. So I understand the first question is who I am. So I started my career at the company called Nissho Iwai. This is a general trading company called
Nissho Iwai.
Yeah, it's a Sogo Shosha. Yeah, it's like a Mitsubishi or Itochu or something like that, and it's a general trading company. I was in the telecom sections, export and importing and selling some telecommunication related equipment. For example, like selling some mobile infrastructure to Brazil or Russia or some Argentina and so on, and also making a lot of investment in the telecom carriers, and also providing financing to sell those infrastructure equipment. So that was my job. I was like selling Qualcomm equipment, so selling Qualcomm licensing and so on. And when I was stationed in US, that is the time I started to invest in the telecom-related startup company in the U.S. And help them go into the Japanese market. So at that time, internet is really booming. There's a lot of requirement for the bigger capacity for internet, for the data and so on. And so there's a lot of great technology in the U.S. So it was. And the high demand in Japan. So it was a good business. There was we make some good business in selling those equipment or software in Japan, but also we made some good return on that investment as those companies went public. So, but we decided to spin out the operations because if I want to go to Japan, my company, Nissho Iwai, has been very strong in the telecom field. However, not dominating in every sections. So I think we want to have our raison d'etre is helping this U.S. startup to go to Japan. I don't have to be bound by it. I have to be bound by one corporation. So I want to have some free hand to work with various companies, and also as a VC, the VC is a job that you constantly invest. So you don't have to be influenced by the headquarters business. So we decided to spin out the operation, become independent, and raise capital from the U.S. and Canadian institutional investors. At that time, we raised around $100 million, and deployed that capital to invest in the U.S. technology company and help them expand to the Japanese market. So that was my first startup. And then
I have a question.
Yes.
At the time,
Yeah.
like Google or Microsoft was already exist in the States? I see.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So we invest in lots of semiconductor company, storage, security, semiconductor equipment, and others. Mainly in the technology field. Yeah. So I spent 9 years in the U.S. And then I decided to come back to Japan and start some technology investment in Japan.
Okay, you independent.
Yeah, as an independent.
Okay.
As a firm. As a firm. Yeah.
Okay, so I think this making decision is not easy. Okay, I have to go back to my country. So how was it?
Well, first of all, I get out of that large organization in the U.S. So my first startup, independence was in the U.S. The main reason is, I think it's because of the United States. U.S. has a culture that is, you always ask people to challenge. And if you live in Silicon Valley, you're surrounded by lots of challenger entrepreneurs. Those people, I'm sure those people living in Silicon Valley, there's some kind of virus or something. It's really make me, it's lots of influence from those guys. Oh man, I just like him or her. I like to start something new. So that is one reason. Yeah, I don't want to spend my life just collecting their salary in their large organization. I want to make things. I want to do things. Yeah.
So brave, cool.
Yeah. Well, that's natural. That wasn't very natural to me. Yeah. So that was main thing. And also the other reason. You mentioned about the Japan. So in the U.S. I was having some good time, and my return was very good. And I started to build lots of network in the Silicon Valley. So mainly I have the opportunity to work with top tier U.S. VCs. So I was happy, but decided to go back to Japan when the Japan was not totally, entrepreneurship is almost zero. And VC is acting totally different ways. And level of entrepreneur is much smaller as compared to these days. Yeah, but I want to be I think if I want to be a top venture capitalist in Japan, and in order to do that, I have to go and struggle in the hard days. If the ecosystem is grown and is mature, and I can go there at that time, but I think I wanted to that is like a I don't know how to say, but it's a piggybacking somebody's effort, or just writing someone's effort. The big difference between Japan and U.S. ecosystem, that what needs to be done. So I think I will be in a position to go there and influence people and try to change that culture. I don't know to what extent I could do that, but I don't know. That is the thing that can help, and also things. I learned a lot from the U.S. venture capitalists or even entrepreneurs. So it came to think about how can I do that? What should I do to pay it back? So I really appreciate the way that the top venture capitalist it works, and I'm learning a lot, and I really learned about how they cope with entrepreneur, how to help them, and in order to, I was so grateful for that, and in order to pay it back, just showing the appreciation is okay, but maybe doing some building my career in the U.S. that is one way, but building my career in Japan and execute on what I have learned from like John Jarvis from Menlo Venture, Paul Weinstein from Azure Capital, or many other guys, Don Valentine. I haven't met her, but many things that I've learned. If I can execute my learning from them, that is a way to contribute or to show my appreciation to those my sensei.
I love that.
Yeah, so I think that is another reason why I decided to come back to Japan.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Ken, Part 1, Entrepreneurial Spirit to Japan. Ken was deeply influenced by Silicon Valley's entrepreneurial culture, where innovation and risk-taking are highly encouraged, surrounded by startup founders and top-tier venture capitalists. He felt inspired to take on new challenges. This environment helped shape his decision to leave a large corporation, start his own firm in the US, and later return to Japan to influence the startup ecosystem. Example, Ken compared the US and Japan's startup environment and recognized that Japan lacked the same culture of risk-taking. Instead of staying in an already mature ecosystem, he wanted to contribute to Japan's early-stage startup scene and help create a more dynamic environment. Key insight: exposure to high-growth entrepreneurial ecosystem like Silicon Valley can inspire individuals to take bold risks and create meaningful change in their home markets. 2. Building a hands-on VCs to support Japanese startups' global expansion. Ken co-founded Global Hands-on VC, a firm that provides not just funding but also strategic hands-on support to Japanese startups looking to expand globally. The firm was established with partners who have strong background in both Japan and the US, including former executives from Oracle and Salesforce Japan and top-tier software engineering experts. Example, many Japanese startups struggle to enter the global market due to culture and business difference. Ken's VC firm bridges this gap by leveraging the experience of its international partners and providing startups with direct access to key players in Silicon Valley. 3. Paying it forward, transforming Japan's startup culture. Ken's return to Japan was driven by a desire to give back to entrepreneurial community by applying what he learned from Silicon Valley top VCs. He recognized that Japan's startup ecosystem was still developing and wanted to contribute to its growth rather than just benefiting from already mature market. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give it a like. Next episode is the conversation with Ken Part 2. Please stay tuned. Bye bye. またね。